To be shocked at how deeply rejection hurts is to ignore what acceptance involves. There are few things as disheartening as romantic rejection. On the face of it, nothing particularly out of the ordinary has happened. We have harbored an affection for someone who does not feel the same way about us. What could be more normal than this? We do not fancy the vast majority of people that we come across, so it was, on the face of it, pretty likely that we fell into the large category of people our beloved does not want to be with, and not the thimbleful of people that they do. But, despite this unremarkability, romantic rejection tends to really sting. I probably don't have to convince you of this. Unless you are Henry Cavill or Joanna Lumley, you have almost certainly been or felt romantically rejected at some point in your life. But the question remains, why does it hurt so much? Well, to continue this mini-series I've been writing on aspects of the philosophy of love, we will set to answer this very issue. Get ready to learn why rejection can strike at our identities, how our imagination can turn into our worst enemy, and why there are so many people online bitter about love. Before we get started, I just want to emphasize that love and romance are deeply individual experiences. In this video, I will draw from philosophy, psychology, and literature to try to piece together a sort of philosophical theory of rejection. But if it does not chime with your personal experiences, that is absolutely fine. It is largely to serve as an aid to your own thinking. Let's begin by examining the first arrow in the quiver of rejection, the way it relates to our sense of self. 1. The self, belonging, and uncertainty. In between smoking, glasses of red wine, and aiding the French resistance, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote an awful lot about how we construct our identities, as well as our relationships with other people, and how these two are inextricably intermingled. In Sartre's philosophy, most of us go through a lot of life in a sort of pre-reflexive state. This sounds pretty complicated, but in some ways it's very intuitive. Think of how we engage with the world. Most of the time, we are not viewing ourselves as an object that other people are aware of, but rather we see it through our own eyes. That is, we are thinking of ourselves primarily as a subject and an experiencer, and everyone else as analogous to an object. This does not mean that we are objectifying them in the modern sense of the word, but rather just that we are viewing them as things that we are seeing and us as the thing doing the seeing. However, this state of comfortable unself-consciousness simply cannot last forever. At some point, we become hyper-aware of the fact that we are an object in everyone else's world as well. Just as we make snap judgments of others, they do the same thing to us. We suddenly realize our own place in the existence of other people. Moreover, we recognize that our own view of ourselves is not necessarily more important than theirs. Sure, in some ways, we have access to privileged information about us that no one else has, like our inner thoughts. But in other ways, they can more accurately judge us than we can. For instance, they can see our actions from an outside view, whereas we are an inherently pretty biased party. This moment of realization is known as the look, though I'm somewhat simplifying Sartre's concept here. This idea was probably best illustrated in his play No Exit, which I actually end up talking about a fair amount on this channel. Here, 3 people, Estelle, Inez, and Garcin, are imprisoned in hell for all eternity. But rather than pitchforks and flaming lakes, hell is instead just a ghostly decorated room that has no mirrors in it. The characters in the play are forced into the permanent position of seeing themselves only through the eyes of the other. In fact, this is where the famous quote, "Hell is other people," comes from, and is also probably the inspiration for the Netflix show The Good Place. In particular, the character of Estelle becomes very distressed at the lack of mirrors, saying, "When I can't see myself, I begin to wonder if I exist at all." As a result, she pursues the romantic attention of the only man in the room, Garcin. Here, she wants to be reassured of a number of things about her self-concept, that she is attractive, admirable, and worthy of love. When she initially fails to obtain that from Garcin, she is distraught. Not only is this a straightforward romantic rejection, it is also a rejection of the view of herself that Estelle wants to hold. It is not just a blow to her eternal romantic prospects, it is a wound to her ego. The word ego has negative connotations in the modern day to do with sports cars, Botox, and aspersions thrown at one's genitalia. But here, I just mean it as the way we perceive ourselves when we become aware that we even can be perceived. That is, our self-concept. Sartre's theme was later picked up by the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who theorized that an awful lot of our self-image is shaped by our parents or caretakers very early in life. and is then refined by others further down the line. For him, we come out of the womb not knowing anything about ourselves, or even that we are a physical object, like a table or a chair, just one that can write poetry and scream. But then, after a while, we recognize ourselves as a reflection in the mirror and an object in the sight of other people. And, at this vulnerable stage, some ideas about who we are begin to form. They may or may not be correct, but they become pretty deep-rooted either way. The significant dependence our self-conception has on the judgments of others, or the other if you're being technical, then allows us to interpret the experience of romantic rejection with a bit more clarity. We often perceive a romantic proposal as a relationship between two people, the proposer and the proposee. But I think it might be more helpful to view it as a four-part relation. There are two people, and then there are the lingering ideas those people have of who they are. For the proposer, this puts them in a very vulnerable spot. For many of them, propositions like I am attractive and I am romantically lovable are, if they are held at all, likely to be held pretty loosely. This is for the simple reason that we do not walk around being affirmed as Adonis-like sex gods with arrays of eligible suitors falling at our knees. That would certainly be nice, but apart from a few select enviable genetic masterpieces like the above-mentioned Henry Cavill and Joanna Lumley, it is simply not our reality. So it is easy to take romantic rejection as evidence against the truth of those propositions that we are attractive or lovable. It lets us know that, at the very least, that person does not view us as attractive or lovable enough to overcome whatever independent reasons they might have for not desiring to be with us. Or it may be that they simply do not desire us. Which is not even that unusual, again, considering that we do not want to be with the vast majority of people we come across. The trouble with properties like attractive and lovable is that, even more so than other attributes, they seem defined by how people treat us. It seems outright contradictory to say he is attractive but no one is attracted to him, or he is lovable in spite of the fact that no one loves him. As a result, repeated rejection will probably hit significantly harder than even the standard ways we are judged by other people. Because, unlike with properties like intelligence, physical strength, or Aristotelian virtue, it is not just that other people's opinions may indicate whether we have these attributes. They arguably constitute us having them. And this is a really vulnerable spot to be in. So, let's think for a moment about how this clarifies the stakes of rejection. Genuinely feeling like you are incredibly unattractive or unlovable is a deeply hurtful state. Even more so now, when our methods of communication and connection are increasingly image-based and aimed at exhibition. You can check out my video on Byung-Chul Han's The Transparency Society if you want to learn more about that. The extent of this impact upon self-image will probably vary wildly between people. For example, a friend of mine from school has been their attractive, confident self from pretty much as soon as they hit puberty. They had repeated affirmations of their own romantic lovability from this point forward, and as a result, they are one of the few people I know who have almost no sensitivity to rejection. Their own self-perception in this regard is encased in iron and cannot be shaken. Whereas myself and many others who went through a phase between the ages of 13 and 17, looking a bit like a goblin who had crawled their way out of a nearby swamp, will likely hold the idea that they might be attractive or lovable much more loosely, and so plausibly would be shaken by rejection at a much deeper level. This is ultimately just speculation. I'm only mentioning it because it chimes with my anecdotal experience and may also chime with yours. And this is also our first step to understanding why rejection hurts so much more than we think it should. The picture we have of it as a relatively unimportant interaction between two people is arguably a drastic oversimplification of the dynamics at play. Much of the hurt may have nothing to do with the relationship between the lover and the rejecting beloved, but rather between the lover and their own sense of self. But, with the stakes properly set, let's look at another essential part of how rejection can sting so much. It has almost the perfect recipe to capture our imagination and stick in our minds. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The mystery box and the torture of fantasy. In my video on the philosophy of the crush, I made extensive reference to the works of Stendhal and how he thought our ideas of the people we love become distorted in our minds to exaggerate some of their best qualities and downplay some of their worst. He called this crystallization. And the term, and indeed the observation, has been borrowed by psychologists in recent years in the study of limerence, a type of pretty unpleasant romantic obsession. In that video, we looked at how the imaginative mechanism was partly maintained by the fact that we do not have direct access to what is going on in our beloved's head. There is enough uncertainty about their attributes and whether they feel the same way about us that it creates an impossibly alluring puzzle. Firstly, this already helps explain why rejection can hurt. If we have an idealized image of what our beloved is like, then we can also be tempted to imagine life with them would somehow be perfect. All our problems would fade into the background and we would gallop off into the sunset in a carriage pulled by dreams. By contrast, rejection then means mourning the loss of this fantasy. Again, it's no longer an interaction between a rejecter and a rejectee, but rather a rejecter, a rejectee, and the rejectee's imagined version of how their life together would be. This, rather unhelpfully, magnifies the perceived consequences of the rejection and makes it hit an awful lot harder. However, I also want to expand upon Stendhal's point here by suggesting that just as we can use our imagination to crystallize our beloved into an idol, we can also use it to torture ourselves about the reasons we may have been rejected or otherwise are failing in our romantic ambitions. Of course, part of the trouble is that it makes total sense to want to know why we have been rejected. It might be immensely helpful information. If it turns out that we have a dismal fashion sense or come across as needy, then this is an excellent data point to take with us into further romantic encounters. However, comforting as it would be for people like me, our rejections are not often accompanied by a wonderfully itemized list of things we did to put them off. Instead, we are often reassured with a vague platitude, like, "it just isn't the right time," or "I'm not ready right now." And these may well be genuine reasons. They are the reasons I've honestly given for rejecting people in the past. But they have become so overused and cliché that it's impossible to tell. None of this is really the rejecting person's fault. They are almost certainly just trying to spare our feelings. And we must also remember that rejecting someone is itself a pretty uncomfortable and unpleasant thing to do, with some rejectors reporting more distress than the rejectee, which in itself is a fascinating topic and probably worth its own video. Part of the reason Stendhal says our beloved can occupy our minds is because the stakes seem extraordinarily high to us, and we also cannot directly know what our beloved is thinking. But the exact same setup exists for the question of rejection. At one end of the spectrum, it might be that this truly was just an issue of timing or something else outside our control or character. And on the other, there is some distressing confirmation of a deep-seated anxiety or insecurity, possibly about some immutable characteristic of ours. This strikes me as the perfect recipe for a sort of negative crystallization. Though, of course, this will highly depend on individual experience. Many of us have a tendency to assume the worst when it comes to a question like this, in order not to be the fool living in ignorance. There can be a dark thrill in the idea that we are uncovering an uncomfortable truth, despite all of the cliches that are offered to us as reassurance. It is one reason why some social media creators confess to scrolling through their comments until they find one that is cruel. The evidence that our insecurities are true can be strangely comforting, and we already have a predisposition to believing them. Either way, the question is then settled, if in an unpleasant direction. The archetypal example of this is Heathcliff from Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Upon hearing a conversation by the woman he loves, Catherine, he immediately interprets it as a confirmation of all of his worst fears about himself. He then flees in a rage, not realizing he has now doomed any chance he had of being with Catherine, who is then married by the time he returns. It is also very easy to waver between the relaxing and unsettling answers to "why have I been rejected," so that the issue never gets put to rest. This repeated exposure can also make the question of rejection seem even more significant. With each time we turn it over in our minds, we amplify its importance, and thus the likelihood that we will continue to dwell on it. Even in the huge number of cases where the rejection likely didn't have that much to do with our personal qualities. To draw upon another of Stendhal's observations, it is notoriously difficult to figure out why we have fallen for someone in the first place. What initially drew us to them? There is an old Buddhist fable that illustrates the point of this section quite nicely. Here we are told that sufferings and misfortunes are a bit like having two arrows flung in your direction. The first is the event itself, which hits us and then immediately causes us some pain. However, the second is formed from our reaction to the event. Do we obsess on it, causing our upset to multiply? Or do we carefully watch our own reaction, ensuring that we do not get hit by the optional second arrow? In my video on crushes, we concluded that we might be wary of allowing our imaginations to run wild to construct an idealized version of our beloved, and I think here we can take a similar lesson. Most of the time, we will not know with any certainty why someone has rejected us, or even why they might not find us attractive. If there is an obvious answer, that is fantastic and may be valuable information. But if not, then we might wish to restrain our imaginations in the same way Schopenhauer wanted us to restrain our wills, to avoid crystallizing a version of the rejection that is as inaccurate as it is damning. But next, I want to look at the way rejection can reveal a truly ugly underbelly of the human psyche, and the way we sometimes use it as a catalyst for a deeply self-destructive cycle. 3. Rejection, resentment, and aggression. The Russian author and philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky famously remarked that hell could be defined as the inability to love. And I would like to draw upon this idea as well. Because social and romantic rejection has another danger, and that is its ability to sow a hateful and resentful attitude in us, which can then create a vicious cycle, making us lonelier and more bitter, which only guarantees our future isolation. I want to clarify here that I'm going to broaden the scope of this section beyond romantic love to also encompass social love and friendship, because I think they often address similar human needs for connection and companionship, but in different ways. Perhaps the epitome of the resentful figure in Dostoevsky's writings is the underground man from his Notes from the Underground, or just Notes from Underground, depending on your translation. This character's philosophy is best summed up in his declaration, "Let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea." He honestly hates the universe and pretty much everyone in it. Dostoevsky explores the many avenues that cause the man's descent into this unenviable state, including his personal philosophy, as well as his misplaced sense of intellectual superiority. But he also examines the underground man's social rejection, and how this embitters him to people in general. The underground man feels that no one shows respect to him, enjoys his company, or accepts him in any way. This goes well beyond the romantic, though it also does include that sphere. In one story, we discover just how little his so-called friends think of him. The underground man feels as if they look down on him, and he may be right in this assessment. They reluctantly allow him to join them for dinner, but do not tell him the correct time, causing him to get there an hour early. He again senses their rejection of him and flies into a rage, cursing them in the strongest terms, which they briefly react to before ignoring him pretty much entirely. At the last moment, he begs for their friendship, but then they reject him again, leaving him alone and desperate. Obviously, this is already a pretty unpleasant situation, but I want to focus on what happens next. In classic Dostoevsky fashion, the underground man strikes up a brief friendship with a lady of the night named Liza, or Lisa, depending on how you pronounce it. However, the minute he senses they may be becoming close, he preemptively rejects her company, insulting her and causing her to run off into the night, a memory which still causes him unhappiness whenever he thinks of it. The order here is important. The underground man already begins the story very resentful, which then puts him on edge with his potential friends. This, in turn, causes them to reject him. Then, with this further rejection, he decides to spurn any attempt at connection, including with Liza. There is a clear downward spiral. Each rejection only makes him more resentful, yet this resentment causes him to try to reject others first. To save himself the embarrassment of being spat on again, he lashes out at the next person to show him a small kindness. Interestingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, Dostoevsky's observations have found a lot of support recently in empirical work around social rejection. Funnily enough, there are 2 chapters in the Oxford Handbook of Social Rejection that contain excellent surveys of the published literature here. First, the chapter by Cavallo and Holmes draws upon a wide range of sources to support the idea that when someone feels devalued by their romantic partner, they tend to engage in self-protective behaviours, like pulling away from them to avoid further hurt. While another chapter by De Waal and Twenge point out that rather than seek the approval of others, socially rejected people tend to lash out with heightened aggression. This lends some credence to the old proverb that a child rejected by their village will burn it down simply to feel some warmth. Of course, the tragic irony in both of these approaches is that they run directly counter to the sought goals of the rejected person. In either case, they react to the rejection by striking out at the very thing they genuinely want. It runs perfectly in line with Nietzsche's observations that when we feel powerless or helpless, unable to achieve what we truly desire, we can react in a self-protective fashion by devaluing that thing instead. In fact, he thought this was the characteristic behavior of the resentful. So, to put this back in a romantic context, sometimes the rejected party can react aggressively towards the rejecter, or even towards the concept of romance in general, because the powerlessness provokes a resentful response in them. To again draw from some anecdotal evidence to illustrate this point, You can scroll through some of the screenshots sometimes posted online of so-called nice guys and nice girls becoming standoffish immediately upon being rejected by someone who they almost idolized only minutes before. This is not to excuse such behavior, but simply to understand it. If we pretend that people respond to rejection purely by becoming sad, then I think we are sanitizing what often happens in the cases of both social and romantic failure, which can often be aggressive, ugly, and fueled by envy and resentment. Any philosophical treatment of rejection must confront this. I largely bring this up because we pretty much all face rejection at various points in our lives, albeit in different amounts. We might become outcast by our friends, or face endless roadblocks in our quest for love, or find ourselves socially ostracized at work. And at those times, we may find ourselves beginning to feel resentful. Hell, at points this resentment may even be justified. I know someone who faced endless social rejection at school purely because of his very visible disability. However, justified or not, this resentment is unlikely to help us. The observations of thinkers like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, as well as more recent empirical research, can help us understand that while this resentment reaction is somewhat natural and understandable, it is nonetheless self-destructive. On the one hand, it is simply unpleasant to feel and is hardly likely to help us get over the incident. But on the other, it runs directly counter to what might genuinely make us happy. The underground man could have had a companion, but he was already so eaten up with resentment that the thought of a genuine connection with another person seemed impossible. He expected isolation, so he acted aggressively and made his own prediction startlingly accurate. It is not pleasant to acknowledge this human tendency, but ignoring it only means it is more likely to take us unawares. If there's one thing to take away from the video, it is probably this: we should be very wary of resentment. But lastly, I want to end with some thoughts on rejection that I hope can lend some dignity to the experience and alleviate some of the deep shame at being upset with one's social rejection or romantic failure. 4. Dignifying rejection. A common theme we've been exploring in this series on love is that, despite the hold it has over our culture, we often denigrate people for suffering on love's behalf, or how it affects us. This is not just a modern idea. Even the soldiers in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra mock Antony for the effect his love has had on him. But I think this is a shame, because for many of us, the trials and tribulations of love, friendship, and social connection will form some of the highest and lowest points in our lives. Throughout his work, Byung-Chul Han has talked about the increasing prioritization of acceleration and productivity in our societies, and how this has led to a devaluing of other things, including interpersonal connection. But all of this contradictory messaging means we are both given the idea that love is vital for a fully rounded life, and that it is a childish side project that we should not let take up too much of our mental energy. I think this is deeply unfortunate. It prevents us from acknowledging this aspect of our experience and encourages us to instead be embarrassed of it. I think the first step to dignifying rejection may be to recognize its near universality. I've been reading an awful lot of Schopenhauer recently, and one of his most interesting ideas is that we should consider ourselves part of a universal community of suffering. Schopenhauer was a pessimist and thought that life was largely characterized by displeasure with small breaks for temporary, dissatisfying relief. He thus advised us to greet one another as fellow sufferer and take some small comfort in the fact that we are all in the same boat. While I am not as pessimistic as Schopenhauer, I do think that his observation that it's reassuring to know we are not alone in our difficulties is bang on. The realization that billions before us have been pained by the same type of event, and billions after us will be in the future, lets us know that we are not uniquely maligned. We might even recall some figures we admire who have faced the same issue, such as Dostoevsky with his first love, whom he was initially rejected by, and even when they did wed, they found the marriage miserable. Or Franz Kafka, whose lack of long-term luck in love is almost legendary. This can help remind us that social and romantic rejection is not just something that happens to the pitiable and the irredeemable, but also to some of the greatest minds in history. It does not, by itself, denigrate us. Secondly, understanding why a rejection might hurt so much can encourage some much-needed patience with ourselves. One of the unfortunate side effects of sidelining the importance of interpersonal relationships is that we treat the pain caused by them as if it were both incomprehensible and deeply shameful. We are adults. Surely we are not reduced to misery over a simple no. But realizing that rejection often ties into our conception of ourselves and our lovability can help us realize where all of this hurt might be coming from. Understanding the role imagination and resentment plays in the intensification of that pain can also make us aware of some of the causal factors involved so that we can do something about it. Keeping a close eye on when we are letting rejection become the focal point of our reflection, or where we find our minds becoming ever more resentful and envious, can help stop the downward spirals rejection can cause in their tracks, giving us back some control when our minds can feel dangerously out of our hands. Thirdly, it's worth being aware of just how strange romantic scenarios in general make us behave. As I have emphasized in my other videos on love, it is one of the only states that can consistently provoke irrationality and extreme emotional responses in us. Stendhal's work on love contains numerous illustrative and amusing anecdotes of this. People who are otherwise perfectly normal, reasonable, and erudite suddenly lose their heads and fall into the depths of infatuation, despair, or both. This also makes sense from the perspective of someone like Schopenhauer, who held that love came from our deepest instincts and the will to life that was fundamentally irrational. Though romanticism is often thought to have overemphasized the highs of love, it also brought the lows into stark relief. Tales like The Sorrows of Young Werther or Turgenev's First Love both show perfectly sensible young people driven to madness by the trials and tribulations of love. The point here is not to say that this is a good thing, or really even an outright bad thing, but rather that it is an ordinary and expectable thing, and not something that makes us uniquely pathetic. Because it is tempting when we realize that we are blowing the impact of rejection out of all proportion to condemn ourselves as idiots. But I think this is a little harsh. General reasonability in the rest of our lives may be no true guard in situations of love and romance, and it is worth being aware of this in advance, so we can bear its pains without our entire self-image collapsing. Though it may feel it, we are not actually going mad. But lastly, it is worth noting that there are precursors to the pain of rejection. Characters like the Underground Man or Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights take rejection so hard because they feel themselves outcast by the only people that matter to them. In the Underground Man's case, he becomes so insecure that everyone's opinion matters to him in a sort of twisted way, yet he hates them all for this and as a result drives them away. For Heathcliff, his love has given him blinkers to the extent that only Catherine's opinion matters. And so his rejection by her strikes at the core of his being, transforming him into an envious, spiteful, angry creature. This makes perfect sense given what we said in the first section of the video. Since we are reliant on other people to confirm certain important facts about ourselves, if we are rejected by all who can do this in a way that matters to us, then of course we will become miserable. The Underground Man and Heathcliff are quite nice examples of this because they lie at two ends of a scale. The first values the opinion of basically everyone, despite his protestations otherwise, and so is constantly hurt by rejection and disrespect. Whereas the other cares basically only for a single person, and so his self-concept is entirely based on her opinion of him. Perhaps, following Aristotle, we could find a golden mean between these two extremes. As we've seen here, much of the pain caused by rejection is to do with what we think that rejection says about us. So having a few people whose opinions we value and trust can do wonders both for ensuring that we become the person we desire to be, and also to reassure us in the face of less reliable judgments. This is one use Aristotle saw for his celebrated friendships of virtue. You can rely on them to be honest with you about you. Relying either on everyone's judgments or just a single person's view sounds like a recipe for disaster. But a small collection of people whose opinions we deeply value, that sounds like an important guard against the instability of both romantic and social rejection. It seems like it would serve as a valuable buffer to all of the causes of pain we have examined here. It can provide an accurate assessment of our characters from someone who knows us well, and as a result can also help stop our imagination worrying as to what this rejection ultimately means, which may be nothing. Finally, the love and companionship of these friends can help remind us that even when we are rejected, we are still not alone and are still very much loved. It is much harder to feel resentful under these circumstances, and so the prospect of lashing out at the world is significantly less attractive. There is also some research to suggest that strong social ties, a feeling of power, and a feeling of authenticity all help reduce the sensitivity we feel towards rejection. Of course, all of this is open to revision and change and development. I largely intend it to be an aid in your own philosophizing about rejection. So do let me know your personal reflections on why it seems to hurt so much, and, ultimately, what we can learn from it. But if you want to explore some of these themes in more detail, then click here to look at my analysis of the problems love faces in the modern day, and some ways we might learn to move past them. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.